Well, speaking of the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party, I'm very pleased to say we have a distinguished historian and author, Dr. Bradley Thayer, with us. He has recently become a professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio. He is the author of numerous books on the subjects of what the Chinese are up to, among other topics. And he's agreed to join us today to talk quickly about Xi Jinping and communist fundamentalism and why another Tiananmen Square is possible. Brad, welcome.
Indeed. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I'd like to thank Brian Kennedy, of course, and Frank Gaffney, and all of those who made this gathering possible, but also those who have supported in every way this committee and its important work. I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about Xi Jinping and communist fundamentalism, why another Tiananmen Square massacre is possible. As we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, it's important not only to remember the terrible tragedy and the viciousness and determination of the Communist Party of China to stay in power, but also to recognize four additional elements. First, this was a terrible lost opportunity for China. Secondly, to understand the lessons drawn by both Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. Thirdly, to recognize that it could happen again in Xi Jinping's China. And fourth, it's a seminal event that draws a sharp distinction between the West and China under the Communist Party. And in a certain and very direct respect, it made the rule of Xi Jinping possible. In the late spring of 1989, millions of people went to the streets in Beijing to demand political reforms. It was perhaps the largest peaceful protest in China since the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, and perhaps even the largest event in the history of modern China. What was unique about the pro-democracy movement that gathered in Tiananmen Square was that the protesters came from within and outside of the Communist Party structure. They sought to make China a modern country with democracy and the rule of law. Famously, as Marian Smith observed, they constructed the 30-foot plaster-covered goddess of democracy statue in the center of Tiananmen Square, which recalled, of course, the Statue of Liberty and Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Of course, Deng Xiaoping refused their demands and instead ordered the People's Liberation Army to march into Beijing and retake Tiananmen Square from the student protesters. The party would not tolerate a challenge to its rule, and the PLA attack resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. As we've heard this afternoon, the exact casualties are still unknown due to the Communist Party of China's deliberate cover-up and censorship of the information concerning the event. Of course, 1989 was a momentous year. In the Soviet bloc, pro-democracy movements, at first in Poland and in Hungary, triggered a chain reaction that ultimately led to the collapse of Soviet satellites and later the Soviet Union itself. In contrast, the June 4th massacre is a tragedy for modern China, which took the country in a very unfortunate direction. The real cost of the massacre was that China lost the opportunity to become what China has been, and indeed should be again, a great, enlightened, and sublime power. Deng drew seminal lessons from the collapse of communism in the USSR and its Eastern Bloc allies. Accordingly, he recognized that it was the Communist Party of China's economic performance that would provide legitimacy for the party. And this solution, of course, worked for decades. But heady economic growth is waning in China, and consequently the party's legitimacy is also vulnerable to challenge. Xi drew a very different lesson from the Soviet Union's collapse. He believes the Soviet Party leaders' communist ideals and convictions wavered, certainly after the death of the last true Bolshevik, Mikhail Suslov, in 1982. Those who ran the Politburo lost their faith in communism, and so they lost control of its ideology and ultimately their power. Xi's solution is what may only be considered communist fundamentalism, the desire to return to traditional Leninism and Maoism as political ordering principles, to enforce its ideology and require a resolute commitment to it in order to ensure that the party's control of political thought is maintained and that there will be no crises of faith among the adherents of communism in China. no questioning of the communist fundamentalist beliefs. As a communist fundamentalist, Xi understands that to preserve the party and its control requires tightly controlling the internet to police thought and expression. It dictates absolute loyalty from the military to ensure regime stability. And many measures that he's implemented, including the use of high-tech surveillance, have turned China into a super police state with little room for dissent within it. Xi Jinping's mistakes and gross human rights abuses, such as suppressing millions of Uyghurs and Kazakhs, ensures that a random event may trigger civil disobedience and in turn may evolve into another Tiananmen protest. In sum, a new spark could occur at any time, and as an acolyte of Lenin and Mao, Xi's natural proclivity is to use force and violence to maintain power at all costs. This also means that he'll use any mechanism to crush dissent. The probability of repeating the Tiananmen strategy under Xi is far higher than under his predecessors in post-Dongjing China. Another Tiananmen Square massacre would be a humanitarian disaster, dangerous for China and for the global community. 30 years ago, the U.S. missed a historic chance to intervene to prevent the bloody crackdown in its wake, to labor to weaken the party's chokehold over China. Mark Twain is purported to have written that history does not repeat itself, but it does in fact rhyme. This lamentable past provides a valuable lesson for the United States and its allies to prepare for history's rhyme, should it occur, and act against repression. Finally, Tiananmen is significant because it illuminates the differences between the West and China. It can be said that Stalin was responsible for both saving the Soviet Union through his totalitarianism and ensuring its collapse. His brutal policies, including forced hyper-industrialization, allowed the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazi invasion. But in the long run, the totalitarian system that he created could not change and ultimately collapsed. Likewise, in one respect, Deng saved the Communist Party of China in its rule by brutally crushing the pro-democracy movement in 1989. But ultimately, by so doing, he made Xi possible. Xi may greatly damage or destroy the party's control of China due to his communist fundamentalist beliefs and his reckless ambition. Once the U.S. understands the objectives and ruthlessness that he possesses, that he is in fact a communist fundamentalist, it can recognize the clear danger he presents to U.S. national security interests and to international stability. In the domestic realm, Xi's very clear, calling for the strengthening of the Communist Party's chokehold over the country. His faith in himself and the Communist Party of China is absolute. Internationally, his actions are equally dangerous. Supporting China's aggressive expansion in South China Sea and elsewhere, threatened to use of force to seize and occupy Taiwan, backed authoritarian regimes from Russia to Venezuela to Zimbabwe, and expanded China's influence and control over less developed states through the Belt and Road Initiative. He's the global leader of opposition to the U.S. position in international politics and the present international order, which has kept peace for over a generation and provided prosperity to many millions, including within China. Xi's vision for global politics is one where China is supreme and international order is decidedly illiberal. From Xi's speeches, particularly his speech to the 19th Party Congress, his intent of defeating the U.S. is transparent, as is his desire to replace the dominance in Western values in global politics with those of the values of the Chinese Communist parties. So he's a clear danger to the Chinese people due to his repression, and he's an equal danger to the present world order as a result of his determination to destroy it. To change the situation, much needs to be done. Let me just touch on very briefly two measures. First, Washington needs to reaffirm its commitment to Western values, political ideology of liberalism, and the principles that stand in positive light when compared to Chinese oppressive government. Second, the Chinese people must be supported in their effort to avoid a return to the past, ruled by another communist fundamentalist. Democratic forces, both within and outside the system, must stand up to Xi's dictatorship. And the global community should also send a strong signal to the Chinese people about its preference for a stable and peaceful leader to lead that great nation. For millennia, Chinese civilization was unrivaled in its historical stability, elegance, and sophistication. The Chinese people should be led by a person who's the equal of that greatness rather than by a despot. China has left its political dark ages behind. We can define the period in Chinese history from the First Opium War to the end of Maoism as its dark ages. It has entered a period of a renaissance, where you've seen the rebirth of Chinese power in every respect. The key question for us to consider today is whether China will enter a political enlightenment. Sadly, with Xi's leadership and the party's leadership, it's very unlikely that China will reach any form of political enlightenment as long as the party rules. Well, thank you very much for your attention this afternoon, and my thanks again to Frank and to Brian for the opportunity. Thank you, Frank.
Dr. Thayer has agreed to take a question if there is one. Anybody? Yes, sir. Marion?
Would you just give your thoughts on Xi's use of Maoism, Marxism as an ideology within the party? And do you think that he's a true believer?
Marion, thank you very much for that important question. I think that his use of Maoism as well as Leninism, obviously, if you will, the grandfather of the Chinese Communist Party, is frequent and I believe fervent in his belief. I truly believe that he has looked and studied the collapse of the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies assiduously. That case has been very well studied by them, and they're determined not to repeat their errors. The importance or the abandonment of ideology as legitimating structure for the Soviet Communist Party was seen to be a fundamental mistake, and they're determined not to use that again. So I truly believe that he is a communist fundamentalist, he is a Leninist, he is a Maoist, and he truly believes in the value of despotism and of crushing and not permitting any political dissent within China to sustain his power. And that's a terrible situation for China in which to be.